Good afternoon, colleagues. Before we begin, can I remind members, as I always do, just to be careful observing social distancing guidance when we are in the chamber, particularly leaving the chamber and throughout the Holyrood building. We're going to begin with First Minister's questions. And before we move to the questions, could I invite the First Minister to make a brief statement? First Minister.
Presiding Officer, I will begin today with an update on the key statistics in relation to COVID-19. As of 9 o'clock this morning, an additional 33 cases have been confirmed since yesterday. A total of 1,117 patients who are either suspected or confirmed as having COVID-19 are in hospital, which is a decrease of 51 since yesterday, and the number of confirmed cases within that decreased by 6. As of last night, 34 people were in intensive care with confirmed or suspected COVID-19, which is no change on the figure reported yesterday. I'm afraid that in the past 24 hours, 11 deaths of patients who had been confirmed as having the virus have been registered, and that takes the total number of deaths in Scotland under that measurement to 2,386. National Records of Scotland, of course, has just published its more detailed weekly report. Unlike the daily statistics, its figures don't just include deaths where COVID has been confirmed by a laboratory test. It also reports on cases where the virus was entered on the death certificate as a suspected or contributory cause of death. The latest NRS report covers the period to Sunday, the 31st of May, which is 3 days ago. At that point, if I can remind members, according to our daily figures, 2,363 deaths of people who had tested positive for the virus had been registered. However, today's report shows that by Sunday the 31st of May, the total number of registered deaths with either a confirmed or presumed link to the virus was 3,911. Of those deaths, 131 were registered in the 7 days up to Sunday. That is a decrease of 99 from the week before. The total number of excess deaths, which is the number above the 5-year average for the same time of year, also decreased from 181 to 108. Deaths in care homes made up 52% of all deaths linked to the virus last week. That is down from 54% in the previous week. And the number of COVID-19 deaths in care homes also reduced again from 124 last week to 68 in the most recent week. National Records of Scotland has also published an additional analysis today covering the period up until the 17th of May, and it shows that up to that point, 154 of the COVID deaths reported in hospital were of people who had previously been resident in care homes. All of these figures are, of course, far higher than any of us would wish, and I'm also aware that no statistical trend will console those who have lost loved ones to the virus, and my thoughts and sympathies are with all of them. However, these numbers do provide further grounds for optimism. The weekly number of COVID-19 deaths has now fallen for 5 weeks in a row. They are now at 1/5 of their peak level. Excess deaths are less than 1/8 of their peak level. Deaths in care homes are also now falling week on week. The figures, in my view, reinforce the decision we took last week to ease some lockdown restrictions, but to do so very slowly and carefully. The progress we have made is obvious, but it is still fragile and it could very easily be reversed. That's why it is still so important that all of us stick to the current guidance. People should still be staying at home most of the time and still be meeting fewer people than normal. Life should not feel entirely normal at present. When we do meet people from another household, we should stay outdoors and 2 metres apart from them. We mustn't meet with more than one other household at a time, nor more than one a day, and keep to a maximum of 8 people in a group. We should all wash our hands often and wear a face covering in shops or in public transport. And if we have symptoms of COVID-19, we should get tested and follow the advice on self-isolation. And above all else, Presiding Officer, we should all remember that the decisions we take as individuals right now affect the well-being of all of us. So I want to end again by thanking everybody across Scotland who has been doing the right thing and assure everybody that it is making a positive difference.
Thank you very much, First Minister. Before we just turn to the first question, just to remind members that I'll take all the supplementary questions today after question 7, after the question from Daniel Johnson. Question number 1, Jackson Carlaw.
Presiding Officer, I asked last week how many elderly people in hospital were sent to care homes before mandatory testing for COVID was introduced. Yesterday, we finally got an answer, more than 1,350 people. As we know, just over 1,800 care home residents have tragically since died, having caught the disease. Today, I want to ask what this government is doing to prevent a repeat of this tragedy. Can the First Minister tell us how many of Scotland's 50,000 care home workers have now regularly been tested for COVID, as promised 2 weeks ago by her Health Secretary?
First Minister.
The programme of regular and routine care home staff testing is underway, and when we have the robust and reliable figures to report from that, we will report that regularly. That's the approach we have been taking to all of the data that we have been publishing. And it is important to note that the testing of care home staff requires to be done not on a one-off basis, but on a regular basis. We will also be considering what further groups of the population we will want to test on a routine basis, and that consideration, of course, also includes NHS staff. In addition to that, we will be doing surveillance testing. That already includes some population antibody surveillance testing. And, of course, the other strand, still the main strand of our testing is demand-led, which is people with symptoms. And we all have a duty, of course, to encourage everybody with symptoms to come forward for that testing, although, of course, that is the strand that we will want to see decline, because that will mean prevalence of the virus is declining. So, in relation to the detailed question, we will publish up-to-date data as soon as we're able to do that in a robust and reliable manner.
Jackson Carlo.
The First Minister says that widespread testing of care home staff is now underway. I'm afraid it's difficult to believe. There are 50,000 care home workers in Scotland. If they were being routinely tested every week, there would be a minimum of 7,000 tests a day. Yet yesterday, the total number of tests done for all of Scotland was fewer than 5,000, and the day before that it was fewer than 3,000. It doesn't add up. First Minister, why are care homes being failed again? Surely by now mobile testing teams or GPs should have visited every care home in Scotland. First Minister, is your government not letting care homes down all over again?
First Minister.
No, is my immediate answer to that. I would also say to Jackson Carlo that the evidence, and I should say as a preface to this comment, that I don't consider any death in a care home or anywhere else to be acceptable, or any level of death to be acceptable. Each and every one of them is a matter of deep regret. But we do see now care home deaths, while of course still too high, declining quite rapidly. And we also see from the peak, certainly through to the middle part of May, that care home deaths have been declining slightly faster than deaths in hospitals. So I say that because that suggests that the package of measures we are taking in care homes and to protect care home residents is having an effect. Now, on testing is important. That is why we have extended the numbers and the groups of people that we are testing. The programme of care home worker testing is underway and will continue, and then will be routine and regular, and the Health Secretary will set out, if it's helpful to the Chamber, more details of the programme of that, and as I said a moment ago, we will set out the data from that when that is available. It is, of course, understandable that we look at the overall number for tests, but I think it is also important to remind people that the dynamics underneath that headline number are also important, because we have different strands of testing. Through routine testing and surveillance testing, we would expect those to increase with time, but the on-demand testing for people with symptoms we will want to see reduce, and may already be reducing because the prevalence of the virus in the community is reducing. So we have to understand, and we will continue to try to publish data that gets to the granularity of that, as well as headline figures. So we will continue to take forward these various programmes of work to make sure that as we suppress this virus and as we come slowly and carefully out of lockdown, testing is doing the job in that variety of ways that we require it to do.
Jackson Carlo.
Presiding Officer, the First Minister has said repeatedly at her daily briefings that we need to do all we can to avoid a second spike. That requires delivery on testing. The First Minister says it's improving. Let me then share some figures. We spoke yesterday to one leading care home provider, Renaissance Care. It has 1,150 staff, women and men who have performed heroic and selfless tasks these last 3 months. But only 649 of them have been tested, just 56%. And even then, not on the repeating basis that the Health Secretary promised on May the 18th. What's deeply worrying is that they say 7% of those staff who were tested had no symptoms of the disease, but came back positive for COVID working in care homes. That's the disappointing reality on the ground. Isn't it the case that yet more mistakes are unfolding right now in our care homes, and that these mistakes may yet lead to more deaths? First Minister, it won't be possible to blame these failings on hindsight, will it?
First Minister.
I don't blame anything on anything. I take responsibility for the government's handling and response to coronavirus. I do that day and daily. I do it rightly and properly in this chamber. I have never and never will seek to blame anybody. What I try to do, and try to do this to ensure that the public has the understanding it needs in order to know why it needs to comply with measures, as it is explain as we go the developing knowledge we have of this virus. And I think it would be a bit strange and actually negligent of me not to do that and not to explain how our approach develops and adapts as our knowledge develops and adapts. The programme of care home worker testing is ongoing, and those figures, as I say, we will publish, and then people can track that, and it will require to be regular, which I think was, I don't know if it still is, so I'll be corrected if I'm wrong here, that routine regular part of it is different in Scotland to how it certainly was anticipated to be elsewhere in the UK. But everything we do right now is around making sure that we are suppressing this virus and avoiding, as far as it is possible to do, the risk of a resurgence. That's why this government is taking the very careful, considered, slow, steady and cautious approach that we are taking, making sure we are not coming out of lockdown before we have the certainty and assurance that our programmes for testing, whether it's the routine testing or testing through Test and Protect, are able to keep the virus suppressed, in addition, of course, to all of the actions all of us have to take. So we will continue to take these actions. We will continue to take them based on the best possible evidence, and I will continue to stand up here in this chamber and elsewhere on a daily basis and answer questions and explain the response of this government, because that's my duty and responsibility, and it's one I never have and never will shy away from.
Jackson Carlo.
First Minister, the World Health Organization could not have been clearer at the start of this crisis. It told you, and it said it, the priority was to test, test, test. Yet for care homes, with this SNP government, it has been dither, delay and distract. The tragedy is this: Scotland has the capacity to test. Indeed, if you had used that capacity effectively since the end of April, you could have tested all the residents and staff at care homes twice. Instead, capacity is being squandered, and care home workers and residents who have already endured the horror of this crisis are being let down all over again. Why, 2 weeks on from a promise to test all care home staff, is this government still not getting it right?
First Minister.
I'm sorry, Presiding Officer, but the WHO on care homes did not say what Jackson Carlo has just alleged and asserted. In fact, and I'm sure, given that he's based his questions on this today, he has read the WHO guidance that I'm about to refer to here. The WHO issued technical guidance on infection prevention and control in long-term care facilities on the 21st of March. And all of the guidance that the Scottish Government has issued from the 13th of March, which we updated on the 26th of March and then updated again, I think, in May, has been consistent with the guidance, the technical guidance that the WHO has set out. And we will continue to make sure that we adapt our approaches as any evidence and advice that comes from authorities like that change in the future. So we will continue to take the careful and considered steps that we are taking. We will not shy away from the challenges that we face and the unprecedented situation we're dealing with. But the Scottish Government will continue to take that careful, cautious approach, making sure that we, as we have done, build up our testing capacity, but also, crucially, use testing in a way that is clinically driven. And that is the responsibility I take seriously and will continue to do so.
Thank you. Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and welcome back. First Minister, we all want the country to succeed in containing and then eradicating this virus and so saving lives. But between March and April, we now know that over 3,500 people were discharged from Scotland's hospitals, and 1,431 of these went into care homes. Can the First Minister tell us how many of these people were tested for COVID-19 before discharge? And can the First Minister also tell us how many were sent into care homes where COVID-19 was already present?
First Minister.
Well, as I've said before, we don't yet have the data that will tell us how many older people who were discharged were tested. That is data that the statisticians have to bring together from different sources, but we will continue to publish data as we have it in a reliable form. But I would also remind Richard Leonard that back then, as is to some extent the case now, there were doubts about the reliability, or at least the relative reliability, of testing people who weren't displaying symptoms for COVID-19. That's why the emphasis on the guidance that was issued to care homes, the first guidance being issued on the 13th of March, in line with the technical guidance that the WHO then issued later in March, was about risk assessment of residents being discharged from hospital to care homes, clinical risk assessment and infection prevention and control, including the measures that care home providers required to take to isolate residents and ensure less communal activity in care homes. So at all stages that guidance has been consistent with the evidence and the advice, and it will continue to be so. And I would make the point here again that while nobody will ever hear me minimise the tragedy of what has happened overall with coronavirus, or specifically in care homes, as we see today in the NRS report, we are seeing the numbers of deaths in care homes decline. It is declining slightly faster than deaths in hospital, which says that the measures we are taking in care homes are having an effect, and we need to keep focused on making sure we do the right things.
Richard Leonard.
Thank you. Well, 3 weeks ago I was contacted by a care worker from South Lanarkshire. She had watched the First Minister tell me in Parliament that day at First Minister's Questions that tests were no longer limited to care workers who were symptomatic. But when she approached her manager, she was told that she could only have a test if she had symptoms. When she went onto the online test portal, it told her the same. When she tried the NHS Lanarkshire website, it rejected her. So I wrote to NHS Lanarkshire. They responded on the 28th of May, 15 days after the First Minister's answer to me in Parliament. They told me, and I quote, "We are currently working through the operational implications of the recent Scottish Government announcement on testing of all care home staff on a weekly basis." Well, today I spoke again to the worker who had contacted me. She has still not been tested. She's concerned about her family and for the vulnerable people that she cares for. So, First Minister, when will all those care home workers who want to be tested be tested? And when will we finally see the promise of regular weekly testing being delivered in Scotland?
First Minister.
As I set out a moment ago, this is a programme that is underway and progressing, and the Health Secretary will set out more details of the programme of delivery of that, and we will publish data from that. If Richard Leonard, maybe he did so, my apologies if he did, but if he had contacted me 3 weeks ago, I could have explained the differences between the different strands of access to testing. The testing through the portal and through the drive-through centres is principally for people who are symptomatic. The routine testing of health and care staff and non-symptomatic staff in care homes is being organised through NHS boards with public health advisors overseeing that. So these are the different strands of testing. The one that he is talking about is ongoing, and as I said, we will publish the data from that as that data is in the reliable and robust form that we want all the data we publish to be.
Richard Leonard.
Presiding Officer, I don't doubt that the First Minister believed it when she said that all care home workers would be tested. But there is a consistent disconnect between parliamentary pronouncements and the reality-facing workers in Scotland's care homes on the ground. Promises on pay, on PPE, on testing have all been made, but delivered too late or still not delivered at all. This week, not just care workers' trade unions, but care home bosses have said that the government's focus is on generating headlines rather than delivering for workers on the front line. So, First Minister, as we begin to ease the lockdown, what confidence can these workers have that your government will not just make more big announcements, but will actually deliver the real changes that we need to Scotland's care services, to give people dignity in their final years and to give the people who look after them proper recognition, reward and the respect that they deserve.
First Minister.
Part of my daily responsibility with my ministers is to give people the confidence in how we are dealing with this and to set out very clearly and candidly the steps we are taking and the challenges we face along the way. We've done that every step of the way, which I think, broadly speaking, is the reason why the majority of people in Scotland do express confidence in the way in which the Scottish Government is handling this. But we also see, again, without minimising the tragedy of what we are dealing with here, we see the number of deaths overall and the number of deaths in care homes declining now significantly, which says that the package of measures that we have implemented and are delivering in care homes is having the effect that we want it to have. And we will continue on an ongoing basis to make sure that the policies we are announcing are delivered and that they are delivered consistently, and that we publish the data that allows all of that, of course, to be scrutinised and for us to be held to account. The last point I would make in it is a point that I make genuinely in the spirit that we've always tried to deal with this, of collaboration and partnership. But to use Richard Leonard's term, it's not my term, care home bosses have a responsibility too, working with us in partnership to make sure that care homes are safe. So, let's not forget here that care home providers have a responsibility, our health protection teams and public health directors have a responsibility, and the Scottish Government has a responsibility as well. And it is that collective effort that we will continue to bring to bear so that we hopefully will see the kind of figures that we have outlined today continue, and the number of deaths and indeed the number of new cases in care homes continue to decline, which I think is something all of us want to see.
Thank you. Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
As if the pandemic itself wasn't enough to deal with, the world is also watching with horror at events in the US, where systematic police brutality is being endorsed and encouraged by racism at the highest political level. We stand in solidarity with those who are taking to the streets in the US and around the world to express their anger and to make it clear that Black Lives Matter. Expressing that solidarity doesn't just mean looking at other countries, though. It means challenging ourselves as well. The First Minister recently received a letter from the STUC Black Workers Committee regarding COVID-19 and highlighting that Black and minority ethnic groups remain overrepresented in the at-risk communities identified by the government. Public Health England's report on this issue has been criticised for simply telling us what we already know instead of offering any explanation or solutions. So can the First Minister tell us when the Scottish Government will publish its own up-to-date analysis of the impact of COVID on Black and minority ethnic people, and will she commit to acting on all of the issues raised in the committee's letter?
First Minister.
Well, can I say that I too feel total solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. We are all looking on with concern and horror at the scenes unfolding in the United States, and I believe the President of the United States has a duty to address the underlying causes of the protests, the legitimate protests we are seeing, rather than continuously attacking those protesting. On the issue of taking responsibility ourselves, I couldn't agree more. I made this point myself yesterday. No country, no society is immune from racism. We all have to look ourselves in the mirror, and we all have to consider what we are going to do to combat racism, and I certainly rededicate myself to that as First Minister. On the issue of the letter from the STUC Black Workers Committee, I have received that letter. I've actually just this morning signed a response to the letter, which will go to them this afternoon, which I hope they will see as a comprehensive response to the very reasonable and legitimate points that they were raising. On the issue of analysis of the impact of COVID, as Patrick Harvey is possibly aware, Public Health Scotland released some initial analysis, I think 2 weeks ago today, on the 20th of May, if I'm getting my dates correct, where it said it had undertaken initial analysis to investigate whether COVID-19 outcomes varied by ethnic group. They said in that report that further work was required, and based on the available data to date, the proportion of ethnic minority patients among those seriously ill appeared to be no higher than the proportion in the Scottish population generally, but they caveated that by saying further work was required and further work will be done, and in parallel work has been undertaken to explore and understand the patterns emerging from other parts of the UK. So this is what we take very seriously, and I know Public Health Scotland will be as keen to understand it and report its understanding as quickly as possible.
Patrick Harvey.
I think we should all agree that that further work needs to happen, and I hope the Scottish Government will be able to give us a time frame for when we can expect to see progress on that. But even as we seek to address racism and inequality at home, many of our fellow citizens are looking at coverage of the events in the US and asking, what can we do? I hope that everybody considering joining a protest this weekend will act responsibly and observe social distancing. And perhaps better is something we can do from home, donating to the community bail funds to support those who have experienced the authoritarian response that we're witnessing on our screens. I've made a donation. I urge others to do the same, and I hope the First Minister will join me in that call. Does she agree also that the UK must stop all export licences for security and policing equipment to the US to ensure that this country is not providing the tear gas, rubber bullets and riot gear currently being used against protesters and journalists? And given that the First Minister has previously told us that devolved business funding for the arms industry is for the so-called blue light sector, can she also confirm whether the Scottish Government has given any public money to any company supplying police or National Guard in the US?
First Minister.
On that last point, I'm not able to give that answer right now because I don't have that information, but I will undertake to look into that and come back to Patrick Harvey as quickly as possible. On the point about the further analysis, Public Health Scotland, of course, made the point that there is still limited data in Scotland around this, but as that data increases, then they will want to do further analysis, and I hope that will be as quickly as possible. But I will ask Public Health Scotland perhaps to write to Patrick Harvey directly to set out the timeline and the process which they are going through with that. On the point about events in the United States and protests that people may want to take part in here, I absolutely echo the comments Patrick Harvey has made. We all want to make our voices heard around these things, and everyone has the right to protest. Many of us will have taken part in many occasions in peaceful protests, but right now mass gatherings of people could be a risk to health and indeed to life. So I would appeal to people to make their voices heard safely and not to put themselves and others at risk. And Patrick Harvey has, I think, helpfully listed some ways, including making donations to community bail funds, as ways in which people can do something and make a difference without putting themselves at risk. So I would certainly echo that. The point about export licences, I certainly agree with the sentiment of that, and we will make appropriate representations to the UK Government on that point.
Thank you. Question number 4, Willie Rennie.
The Scottish Government estimates that 19,000 people in Scotland have the virus. Last Thursday, the Test and Protect system started. Does the First Minister know how many of those 19,000 infected people have been tested and how many of their contacts have been traced?
First Minister.
We don't yet have initial data from Test and Protect. I hope that if all goes to plan, the initial data from Test and Protect will be published next week. I would hope this time next week, because again, we have to make sure that is quality assured and that is robust. The 19,000 people, of course, will be people at different stages of infection, and that is a moving picture, and we will produce now every Thursday estimates of the R number and our understanding of the infection. But the information that comes out of Test and Protect will be very important, not just in terms of the numbers tested, but as Willie Rennie rightly says, the numbers of contacts that have been identified and the number of contacts that have been traced. I would make two additional points there, just as context. Of course, we have to ensure that Test and Protect is operating robustly and effectively, and that is engaging with everybody either through testing or tracing that it requires to engage in. But over time, numbers through Test and Protect going up will not necessarily be a good sign, because it will be a sign that the virus is increasing again, and we don't want to see that. And secondly, just as a point of context, while everybody, as they should be doing, is complying with the physical distancing rules right now, the number of close contacts people should have should actually be very minimal. And I think it's important that as we look at these numbers, hopefully next week, those contextual points are borne in mind.
Willie Rennie.
What we do know is that only 264 people have been tested positive since last Thursday. So that's just 1% of those estimated to have the virus. Why are we missing so many people? That's 99% of people that we are missing. Test and Protect was the big idea to drive the virus out of the country, but we discover it's only going to protect us from 1% of the virus. If that's the case, what is the value of the Scottish Government's Test and Protect system? Is it capable of eradicating the virus?
I yes, believe it is capable of playing a significant part in suppressing and hopefully eradicating the virus. I have said all along, as the Health Secretary, and it's a really important message that we must all convey to the population. It will not do that on its own. We all have to play a part in complying with health advice and in particular the physical distancing guidelines. In terms of the numbers quoted, I would, again, without going into too much detail here, although I'm happy to write to Willie Rennie to set this out in a bit more detail if that would be helpful to him. The numbers that we publish daily on positive tests are numbers that come through the NHS lab testing. Of course, the other strand, which is through drive-thrus and the Lighthouse lab, are a separate strand to that. Well, Willie Rennie is saying they're minimal. These are and will grow as well. And we are signposting people through Test and Protect to booking the test through that and going through there. So what I would say to people about Test and Protect is, yes, absolutely scrutinise and look at the detail of that, because you can be assured I and the Health Secretary will be doing that very closely. But let's all of us recognise and take seriously our responsibility to get a message across to people, because we can't force people to come forward for testing, but we have to encourage people to do that and explain why it is so important. So let's all of us take every opportunity to say to people, if you have any of the symptoms of coronavirus, which of course is a fever, a cough or a loss or change in your sense of taste or smell, then don't delay, don't wait a day or two to see if you feel better. Immediately go to NHS Inform or phone NHS 24 and book that test. So if all of us get that message across, then we will see Test and Protect playing the part it needs to play to ensure that we keep this virus suppressed.
Thank you. Question number 5, Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what steps will be taken to avoid a big increase in youth unemployment in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic.
First Minister.
I think all of us recognise the long-term negative impact that periods of unemployment have on anybody, but particularly on young people. We recently announced funding of £33 million to support people back to work as we gradually get the economy opened up again, and that initial funding will focus on helping those most adversely affected, which includes young people. Our Enterprise and Skills Strategic Board will also ensure that we're helping to equip people with the skills they need for the future. It will report back to us later this month. I would point out that in Scotland we do have a track record of tackling youth unemployment through our internationally recognised youth employment strategy, developing the young workforce, and we will continue to support the industry-led developing the young workforce groups to ensure that we continue to provide relevant and appropriate support.
Kenneth Gibson.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. Just agree that whilst COVID-19 is much more likely to have a lethal impact on older people, younger workers are bearing the greatest economic burden. Many worked in hospitality or tourism on zero-hour contracts. For those still employed, even graduates have suffered an 8% fall in hourly wages. In Scotland, 28,191 individuals began an apprenticeship last year. How can struggling employers continue to attract and retain apprentices both during the pandemic and beyond? And does she agree it's time the UK Government scrapped the apprenticeship levy?
First Minister.
The apprenticeship levy was introduced back in April 2017, at the time with no consultation with the Scottish Government, despite, of course, apprenticeships and skills being devolved. And so far, the UK Government has resisted calls from employers to suspend the levy during the pandemic. Apprenticeships form a really integral part of our economy. They give those who take part the opportunity to develop skills while also earning an income. But there's no doubt COVID-19 will have an impact on businesses and apprentices across Scotland. And as I mentioned before, we will consider the recommendations of the Enterprise and Skills subgroup and set out future plans in this area in coming weeks. Skills Development Scotland delivers our apprenticeship programme and has delivered over 250,000 modern and graduate apprentices across this administration up until March 2019. As a result of COVID, of course, we will review our approach to apprenticeships to ensure that it is aligned and responsive to the emerging need of both employers and workers as well, and young workers in particular.
Question number 6, Rachel Hamilton.
To ask the First Minister what support the Scottish Government plans to offer self-isolating people under the NHS Test and Protect programme.
First Minister.
For those who need it, help is available via the Scottish Government's National Assistance Helpline. That helpline links to local authority teams who will provide access to essential food and medicine, emotional and social support. Financial support for those asked to self-isolate will also be critical to the success of Test and Protect. It will be more difficult for people to comply with these arrangements if they face financial hardship in doing so. To that end, I welcome the UK Government's decision to ensure that for those eligible, statutory sick pay will be available for every day they're in isolation. The extension of the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme for a further 3 months is also welcome news. However, I look forward to also hearing from the UK Government about what more can be done through reserve powers to ensure that people who are isolating don't lose out financially.
Rachel Hamilton.
Thank the First Minister for that answer. The new Trace and Protect system is wholly dependent on voluntary compliance. Hugh Pennington, Emeritus Professor of Bacteriology at Aberdeen University, has pointed out that only half of people who develop coronavirus symptoms isolated for at least a week, according to government scientific advisors. In light of this, what assessment has her government made on the issue of non-compliance due to perhaps a reluctance for employers to take statutory sick pay, and what is her response to comments from Professor Pennington, who has warned that if the test and trace system does not work effectively, the only alternative was compulsory random testing in places such as supermarket queues?
First Minister.
I'm not immediately aware of the evidence that Hugh Pennington was citing there. I'm happy to look at it if the member wants to send that to me. But we have always made clear that Test and Protect, well, firstly, that I believe it can play a critical part in suppressing the virus. But of course, it depends on persuading people to comply with everything that we're asking them to comply with. That means coming forward for testing immediately you experience symptoms, and also following advice on self-isolation. In my anecdotal experience, but also in terms of the monitoring that the Scottish Government has been doing through surveys over the course of this pandemic, the vast majority of people in Scotland have been complying with everything we've been asking them to do. That is the lockdown generally, but also isolation in particular, and I would hope that that will continue to be the case. But it is vital, and we've always recognised that the support has to be in place. That support will come in a whole range of different shapes and forms, from financial support, which is very important, through to practical support in very rare cases, I'm sure, but in some cases perhaps support with alternative accommodation, and that's what we are working to make sure is available. I would repeat a point I've already made today, because I think it's a point all of us really have to repeat as often as we can, is that everybody, every single one of us, will reduce our risk of being asked to self-isolate as a close contact of somebody with coronavirus if we are abiding by the physical distancing guidelines, if we're staying at least 2 metres apart from other people. And my final point on this, Presiding Officer, is scrutiny here is really important. But I think all of us have a role to play in making sure that Test and Protect actually succeeds. And that involves all of us making sure that to our own constituents, we are communicating the advice and encouraging them to abide by that advice. And if we all do that, then I have great confidence that Test and Protect will play the part we want to see it play in suppressing and hopefully eventually eradicating the virus.
Thank you. Question number 7, Daniel Johnson.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to reports that Scotland has one of the highest per capita death rates for COVID-19 in the world. First Minister.
Well, in my view, every single death is one too many. Deaths in Scotland are higher than any of us would want them to be. And I, as I've said already today and will continue to say, every single death is a tragedy. We've acted throughout this crisis on the basis of the best available advice to keep this number as low as possible. We are now seeing deaths. Start to fall, although I readily acknowledge that this is of no comfort to those who have lost loved ones to this virus. I would also acknowledge that while the question highlights a particular measure and analysis, there are still differences in how COVID-19 deaths are recorded in different countries. Individual countries are also at different points on the infection curve, so these factors make any direct comparisons at this stage complex.
Daniel Johnson.
The analysis from the Financial Times published at the end of last week revealed that with a total excess death rate of 191 per million, the UK has had the second worst outbreak of COVID-19 in Europe. On the same basis of comparison, Scotland has had 840 deaths per million. That means Scotland has had the third worst outbreak in Europe, worse than Italy, 10 times worse than that of Germany or Denmark. This analysis has rightly provoked questions of the UK government regarding the timing of lockdown, adequacy of social distancing measures, availability and use of testing, deaths in care homes, use of DNR, and also criteria for hospital admission. Does she agree that we must hold the Scottish Government to the same standard, and that those questions asked of the UK Government must be asked of the Scottish Government? And can she confirm that it is the Scottish Government which has been responsible for the timing of lockdown, social distancing measures, availability and use of testing, guidance for care homes, use of DNR and criteria for hospital admission?
First Minister.
I'm genuinely not sure where Daniel Johnson has been over the past few weeks, because I don't think even my worst critic could accuse me of trying to dodge accountability on these issues. I answer questions day and daily for lengthy periods of time, covering all of these issues, and I will continue to do that, because actually I genuinely believe that accountability is important, but I also genuinely believe that I have a duty to set out what steps the Scottish Government is taking, what challenges we're facing, when we're changing the approach we're taking, because evidence has changed, and actually trust the Scottish people to respond accordingly. And by and large, I think the Scottish people have responded magnificently to that. So I will at no stage shy away from my responsibilities and my accountability. And you know, I think people watching at home right now can draw their own conclusions and make their own mind up about that. All I do is simply make the points that are reasonable points about some of our understanding changing, but also the fact that we are not through this pandemic yet. And you know, one of the things that worries me most is a sense of people thinking we're at the end of this and it's all over. It is not all over. We have tough times still to come, and we've got to, as well as looking back and assessing the decisions we've taken previously, we've got to keep focused on taking the right steps for the future as well. So I will continue to do that. I will continue to do it openly and frankly. The only thing that matters to me right now is continuing to take the steps that we need to take to suppress this virus and protect the Scottish population. And if that means learning lessons along the way, we will absolutely do that. But I'm not interested in political game playing of any shape or form right now. I'm only interested in doing the job that I'm elected to do for the Scottish people.
Thank you. We have a usual high level of interest in asking supplementaries. Can I take Claire Adamson to be followed by Ruth Davidson?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the First Minister when the Scottish Government will issue updated coronavirus guidance to childminders?
First Minister.
We, I think, have done that, and if we haven't yet done it, we are about to do that very soon. Childminders are able to restart within phase 1 of the route map out of lockdown, although there are still limits on the number of households that childminders can look after children from. That limit is 4, so that guidance is or will very soon be available to childminders to allow them to get back as far as possible to normal operations.
Ruth Davidson to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm asking this question on behalf of a young father with cystic fibrosis who spent nearly 12 weeks shielding. His twin 5-year-old girls are due to start primary 1 on the 11th of August, and he's worried that they won't be allowed because of his at-risk status, preferring, he says, to leave his family home rather than have his girls miss out on their first day of school. And he's not alone. The Cystic Fibrosis Trust says we need urgent guidance, especially as children start to go back to school and more people return to work. So can I ask the First Minister what response she'd give this young father in particular, and can she also reassure others in a similar situation that when the shielding advice update is finally given, it will include detailed information on freedoms and restrictions for those in the same household as at-risk individuals?
First Minister.
The current period of shielding is due to end on June the 18th, and I have said already, and the Health Secretary has said this as well, that we will publish updated guidance in advance of that, and we will be as detailed and as comprehensive in that guidance as possible. It will be very much clinically driven. It will look as far as possible at the different risk factors and seek to give people as much flexibility and allow as much judgment about the risk factors they face and how they can best mitigate those risk factors and how the government can support them in doing that, to try as far as possible recognising the risks that these groups still face of getting people back to some degree of normal life as possible. So we are taking great care over that, and we recognise in the course of that the impact of somebody who is shielding on others who live in their household, and that will be particularly acute where that is children. So the updated guidance, the reason we are taking time to do that is because we want to be able to answer as many of these questions as possible. Nobody wants to see people shielding any longer than is necessary, but I would remind members that the shielded category are the ones that are at greatest risk of becoming seriously ill or dying from this virus, and therefore it's right that we take as much care as we can. And I think it is really important that we don't act prematurely and that we don't act in giving advice without proper care and consideration. And the final point I would make to the individual quoted, but to the shielded category generally, is one I've made before. The Scottish Government, myself, the Health Secretary, we have not forgotten you. We have not forgotten the difficulties you are facing. But you, your families and your health and your safety really matter to us, which is why we are going to take time to get this guidance as right as we possibly can.
Neil Bibby, to be followed by Colin Beattie. Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Last week, the First Minister agreed with me that strategic intervention in the aerospace sector will be required to save Rolls-Royce jobs at Shannon. Today, plans have been announced to axe 700 jobs that would be devastating for the workers, the West of Scotland economy. It would also be a blow to manufacturing and the end of Rolls-Royce maintenance, repair and overhaul operations in Scotland. First Minister, we cannot let that happen. Can I ask, will the Scottish Government work with the trade unions to put pressure on Rolls-Royce to think again? Is the Scottish Government prepared to make significant financial support available to the sector now? And will the First Minister agree to establish a cross-party aerospace and aviation task force to ensure there is a coordinated collective approach to support these sectors and save these jobs?
First Minister.
Can I thank Neil Bibby for the question, and in general terms agree with everything he has said. The news that workers at Rolls-Royce and Shannon will have got this morning is absolutely devastating, and my thoughts are very much with all of them and their families today. The Scottish Government will continue to do everything we possibly can to get a more positive outcome to this. These jobs are important, the Rolls-Royce facility is important, and of course advanced manufacturing is very important in terms of the Scottish economy now and in the future. In response quickly to the various parts of his questions, yes, we will work, as we always do in these situations, very closely with trade unions. I will ask the Economy Secretary to look at pulling together a cross-party approach so that we can all work together to try to protect and safeguard these jobs. On the issue of financial interventions, as has been the case previously, we will consider all options. I say simply for the record that, of course, we have to operate within state aid constraints, and, of course, we are accountable to taxpayers for the use of taxpayers' money, but we always look for ways in which we can protect jobs and protect important manufacturing facilities like this. So I'll ask the Economy Secretary to correspond further with Neil Bibby and with others across the Chamber with an interest, so that we can try to bring together as far as we can a Team Scotland approach to safeguarding these jobs if it is at all possible to do.
Colin Beattie, to be followed by Peter Chapman.
Can I ask the First Minister whether the UK Government has provided any clarity on whether it will provide £70 million of funding consequentials to the Scottish Government to tackle COVID-19 crises?
First Minister.
There are a variety of strands of consequentials that have been provided, and we continue to talk to the UK Government about the detail of that and about additional areas where we think support would be appropriate. I think I said last week, we had some concerns about consequentials that had previously been announced, now not materialising. We also have some concerns about whether or not any underspends in any of these areas will be clawed back or whether we can reinvest these. I think it's really important that commitments we have made to businesses and people across Scotland are fulfilled, and that means that we must make sure that money that has been committed is not taken away or doesn't materialise in full. So I'll ask the Finance Secretary to correspond with Colin Beattie about the particular aspects of that and to make clear where we have those assurances and where we are still seeking to get those assurances.
Peter Chapman, to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Peter Chapman.
Hi, thank you, Presiding Officer. One of my constituents is registered blind and his wife has eyesight problems which need a visit to an eye specialist. The Health Secretary has been emailed regarding the opening of essential services, such as optometrists, but we have had no reply. This lack of response seems to be a running theme with Jean Freeman, as I have emailed her on several occasions, none of which she has bothered to reply to. So I asked the First Minister, will she tell her Health Secretary to reply to her emails? And more importantly, will she recognise that essential services, such as optometrists, need to open now? And any delay is causing undue stress and concern to many of my constituents.
First Minister.
The member raises a really serious issue, and I'm going to treat it seriously. Because I say on the first part, and the tone of his question, I just think it will jar with the majority of people across the country who have actually, over the past 3 months, seen a health secretary literally working round the clock to try to tackle this virus. And I don't know why the Tories seem to be moving away from absolutely legitimate scrutiny, which is their role, and I absolutely unequivocally accept that, but moving away from that and from a constructive approach into what appears to be attempts to party politicise this issue. Why they are choosing to do that, I don't know, but I don't think it is what the majority of people across Scotland want to see. For my part, for the part of the Health Secretary, we'll just get on with the job of trying to deal with this virus day in and day out. On the issue of the resumption of health services and optometry in particular, we want to see services resume as quickly as possible, and that includes optometry. But as the Health Secretary has set out in the last couple of days, including in this chamber yesterday, we have to do that with careful consideration and within a framework of decision-making to make sure that these services are resuming safely, that the health service is still able to cope with the coronavirus should we see an increase in cases, but also that we are not putting patients at greater risk by resuming services before we are ready to do that. So these are important considerations. They are considerations that are underway, and the Health Secretary, of course, will keep the Chamber and the wider public updated, because I understand how difficult it has been for people who have not been able to access the health service in the way that is normally the case. In some cases, that will have been very painful for people, and we want to see that situation rectified as quickly as possible, but crucially as safely as possible for patients across the country.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Presiding Officer. Charlotte, aged 19, is self-isolating because she lives with her grandparents, but she has a health condition. And Angela, 19, is a shielded person because she has an immunosuppressant condition. But both these young girls gave up employment of actually very good quality jobs because they were shielding not only the loss of income, but the loss of opportunity. I recognise that the First Minister has already answered the question about youth unemployment, which is important. But they get a very generous food box, but no other specific support for their particular situation. Your former government advisor, Naomi Eisenstadt, pointed out that age 19 to 24 is the most critical person in a young person's life, and I believe that's true. What thinking has gone into this particular group of young people who have been shielding and have lost out on those opportunities because been acting on government and scientific advice? Has the First Minister thought about what any positive action could be taken in the future to help this young group of people who have been shielding?
First Minister.
It's a really important point and question to raise, and I want generally to give Polly McNeill an assurance that we are thinking through the issues that shielded people face in all of their complexity, because we talk about shielded people sometimes as if they are a generic group, but every shielded person is an individual with their own needs and circumstances, and I think it is absolutely right to say that this will be a very different experience for younger people than it will be for older people, and it's not an easy experience for older people, obviously. So we're taking all of these factors into account to we're trying to move from a position, in short, where we have given very generic blanket advice to people in a shielded category, to being able to give much more tailored advice that is more specific to different conditions and more specific to people's individual circumstances. But of course, that raises a lot of complexities, and it is really important that we get that right. Now, in terms of the support that's available, of course, there is support in terms of essentials, food and medicine, but we've also given funding to mental health helplines and other services to try to give that broader emotional and well-being support, and I think that will continue to be important in the period to come. The final point I would make here really is about employers, and this will not apply to every single situation, but of course shielded people will often not be ill, they will not be suffering symptoms, and they will still be able to work. So I would appeal to employers, and many of them will be doing that because somebody is shielded doesn't mean necessarily that they can't work. If they can work from home, they should be encouraged and supported to do that. So, you know, just in summary, we understand, and we will all know, I know people who are in the shielded category, I know how difficult it is. So moving from that blanket approach to a much more tailored approach, I think is really important, but I hope people understand that it is people's lives we are talking about here. So given the greater complexity involved in that, it makes it all the more important that we apply real care and attention and consideration to the issues involved.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Alexander Stewart.
Presiding Officer, the Prime Minister expressed shock last week that people who have no recourse to public funds cannot access financial support. It was not a shock to many, including the Kurdish Development Association in Glasgow, who contacted me recently. They told of the impact on many Glasgow residents, including many with temporary leave to remain, who have lived and worked in the UK over a number of years and yet have been forced into destitution because of their immigration status and the impact of COVID-19. Does the First Minister agree with me that now that the Prime Minister has been made aware of this situation, he must ensure decisive action from the UK Government is taken to support those affected by this dreadful immigration rule?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that very strongly. It is, I have to say, inexplicable to me that any Member of Parliament or Member of the Scottish Parliament could not be aware of the issues created by no access, no recourse to public funds. Certainly in the kind of constituency I represent, and the same will be true, obviously, for Bob Doris. These are issues that come across our desks and in our constituency mailbags literally every single day. These are real issues for very many people. The Scottish Government has consistently raised the issue with the Home Office for a number of years, and indeed over the course of this pandemic. And now that the Prime Minister has realised that there are people who do face destitution and hardship because they can't access much needed support, I really do hope that we will see this appalling policy being reversed. In particular, at this time of crisis, people who've come to the UK to work, study, be with their families, or because they need a place of safety, must be appropriately supported as restrictions are lifted so that they can be safe and wider public health can be protected as well. That is absolutely essential if we are to ensure that our communities and economy can recover from this unprecedented situation. So I very much hope that we will see a change of policy from the UK Government very soon.
Alexander Stewart, to be followed by Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While I pay tribute to all teachers who have risen to the challenge in putting in place new ways of working during this pandemic, figures compiled by 5 councils show that 20% of primary school pupils and 40% of secondary school pupils had not engaged with home learning by the end of May. Clearly missing months of schooling will have set these children back a significant margin compared to their peers. Therefore, First Minister, what further urgent support will the Scottish Government provide to reduce barriers to pupil engagement?
First Minister.
Well, it's an important issue. None of us want to see young people lose out on education, and none of us want to see young people being out of school for any longer than is necessary. That's why the most important strand of work in this area which of course has been led by the Deputy First Minister, is in a safe and phased way getting our schools open again as quickly as possible, and in our judgment that is the 11th of August date that we set. We will also though look to increase the number of children that can access critical childcare through the hub system that has been in place throughout the crisis, and hopefully some transition support for pupils going into primary school or from primary school to secondary school during the course of June. But the point about support for home learning is important. When I set out the route map in the Chamber a couple of weeks ago, I announced additional funding for electronic devices for young people in deprived areas to make sure that they are not losing out in that way. And there'll be a range of other ways that working with teachers and indeed parents we will pursue to make sure that home learning is a good and worthwhile experience for young people while it is still required. I want to take the opportunity really in ending this answer by paying tribute to teachers and parents across the country for the really good work they have been doing in very challenging circumstances. And again, to thank young people themselves. This has been an incredibly difficult experience for all of them, but I think they have all responded to it magnificently well.
Claudia Beamish to be followed by Angela Constance. Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. New Lanark is, as many will know, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. All partners and parties need to work together to ensure it has a sustainable future embedded in the values of cooperation for which it is known worldwide, and recognising the importance of connecting with the local community. Can I ask the First Minister what advice and financial support the Scottish Government is offering to the New Lanark Trust in light of the reported precarious financial situation it is in, compounded by the COVID challenges, and now that the concerning recent announcement of a formal consultation process on a number of redundancies, a significant number indeed of redundancies has been made. Thank you.
First Minister.
Well, New Lanark is a truly wonderful place and a real credit to Scottish ingenuity and of course a real jewel in the crown of our tourist industry as well. So we all want to see that flourish in the period to come. The New Lanark Trust, like many organisations, a couple of weeks ago of course I was answering a question about the National Trust for Scotland. Many of these organisations are facing considerable challenges as a result of this crisis. The Scottish Government will work with them as far as we can to provide advice and where possible support to organisations to help them cope with and get through the immediate impact of the crisis, and then look forward to a future where they can continue to grow and thrive again. I'll ask the Communities Secretary to correspond with the member perhaps more specifically on New Lanark Trust to see what conversations and advice we can offer there given their specific circumstances. But we all want to see organisations like this come through this pandemic and able to go once again from strength to strength.
Angela Constance to be followed by Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In yesterday's health debate, at least 3 of us from 3 different parties spoke in favour of establishing a national care service and the need for a refocus on not-for-profit care. Therefore, I would be interested to know what the First Minister thinks about a national care service and how she thinks we could progress this idea collectively and constructively across the parliamentary chamber.
First Minister.
I read the official report of the debate yesterday and saw the comments that were made. I've got huge sympathy with this, and I think without, at this stage, for reasons I'll talk about, going into all of the detail of that, I think it is an example of how we need to be prepared to rethink old ways of doing things and contemplate potentially new and potentially better ways of doing things. And I hope that we may see some cross-party willingness to look at the idea of a national care service. There are huge complexities and challenges associated with that, and none of us should underplay that, but there'll be a whole range of ways in which we want to just rethink how we have done things in the past. Obviously, I will be very happy and indeed very keen and anxious to engage in a more detailed way in this and in other similar debates in the future. Right now, of course, my main focus is getting through the crisis and dealing with the issues and the steps we have to take to do that. But I would pay tribute to Angela Constance and others for even at this stage putting these things on the agenda. One thing I think we should all agree on and unite behind is that while this crisis is not one that any of us would have wished in any way, it does offer opportunities for us to think about doing things differently, and that's an opportunity I think we should grasp with both hands.
Beatrice Wishart to be followed by Sandra White. Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There are 49 jobs at risk at the Moorfield Hotel following plans by oil company Total to move accommodation for its workers at the Shetland gas plant from the Moorfield Hotel to the Sellaness accommodation facility. This is another devastating blow for the Shetland economy, especially in the North Mainland, which has already been hit hard this year with the closure of Scatstow Airport and other redundancies at the Sullomvoe oil terminal. What can the Scottish Government do to prevent these job losses and help those facing redundancy at this worrying time?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Beatrice Wishart for raising what I know is a really important issue, particular to the Shetlands, in some case Shetland Islands, but also general in terms of the impact across Scotland. I will ask the Economy Secretary to correspond with her on the particular issue of the Moorfield Hotel to see whether there is any advice or help we can bring to bear there. But more generally, we know that the hotel sector and the tourist sector more generally is very hard hit by this crisis. And as we come out of lockdown, and particularly as we look at how we get the economy growing and support our economy to recover, making sure that we're providing tailored and appropriate support to the tourist sector is going to be very important. I chair a subcommittee, an economy subcommittee of the Cabinet every Friday morning, and last Friday morning Fergus Ewing led a discussion particularly on the tourism sector. Obviously there are different issues involved in that, but these issues are very much at the forefront of our minds and will continue to be as we go through the weeks and months to come. But on the particular issue on the Shetland Islands, I will ask the Economy Secretary to have further discussions with the member.
Sandra White to be followed by Maurice Corrie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. At this time, many parents are struggling to get through the week, and in particular when their kids are starting to go back to school. The Best Start grant is something which is a fantastic opportunity for them. Can I therefore ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government is doing to encourage parents to, their children coming up to school, to encourage them to apply for the Best Start grant?
First Minister.
Well, I do encourage, and we will take all steps that we can to make sure parents who are eligible for the Best Start grant are aware of it and apply for it, because it provides critical help and support for parents at key stages of their children's life. And I think that's important at all times, but for obvious reasons it's particularly important right now. But I would encourage all members across the chamber to also do whatever they can to make sure that the Best Start grant is known to their constituents, and constituents who are eligible are encouraged to apply for it. But we will look to see how we can raise awareness and market the importance of that as widely as possible.
Maurice Corrie to be followed by Ian Gray.
Presiding Officer, thank you. New guidelines are issued for childminders returning to work, state that they can take children from 4 separate households. Now, the Scottish Government has yet to issue guidelines on grandparents who are responsible for childcare of their grandchildren. Many grandparents are below the shielded age category and without underlying health conditions. Will the First Minister today outline when they can return to their duties, especially given the fact that in most cases they will only be taking children from one other household, creating a lower risk than with childminders?
First Minister.
No, I'm not going to outline that today, because it wouldn't be responsible of me to do so, because all of these things we have to carefully consider. And I appreciate that as we consider these things, as to some extent, notwithstanding my comments on the shielded group earlier, we have to do in a general way. There will be different circumstances within that. And I know that not all grandparents are over 70, and in fact, I know some grandparents very close to me that are not over 70 who would want me to point that out. But it is the case that older people generally are more at risk of this virus than the population generally, and we cannot simply ignore that. We also know that perhaps even more so than with childminders, although I know this will be a factor there, with grandchildren and grandparents, keeping physical distancing and not having a grandchild hug their grandparent is very, very difficult. So we are thinking about these things very carefully and very cautiously, and I know how difficult all of these arrangements are for people, but it is all about trying to keep people as safe as possible, and I will not depart from that careful, cautious way of making these decisions. And we will try, as we go through the route map, to accelerate things where we can, but also at all stages keep in mind the driving imperative both of suppressing the virus overall and protecting those who are most at risk.
Ian Gray to be followed by Julian Martin.
Thank you, and I draw the Chamber's attention to my entry in the Register of Interests. SCVO reported this week that half of all Scottish charities will run out of cash in 6 months and fear closure. Many, perhaps most, have been unable to access crisis funds. How will the First Minister respond to this cry for help from a critical sector?
First Minister.
Well, look, I absolutely understand how critical this sector is, and I deeply, as we all do, value the contribution they make, and I know how much poorer a country Scotland would be without that contribution. So I desperately want to see charities able to get through this crisis and flourish out the other end of it. And I will give an assurance that the Scottish Government will do everything we can to support that. You know, I'm not going to insult anybody's intelligence here. I cannot stand here and give a blanket assurance that we will be able to solve every financial problem for every single charity. And I think people understand that, but we will do everything we can, as we always have done, working with the sector to provide as much support as we can. We have provided some support already during this crisis. And I would say not to try and let the government off the hook, because we've got a key responsibility here, but every single one of us as individuals has a part we can play here. Most of us will now or at some point in our lives have charities that we are particularly close to, that we will donate to, and every citizen across the country can think about, if they are able to, perhaps making a donation to a charity that means a lot to them or a charity they want to support. And if all of us do that, it doesn't take away the responsibility for government, but it will be another example of us coming together as a country to try to protect what really matters most to all of us.
And Julian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to ask the First Minister, in light of moving into phase 1 of the transition out of lockdown, whether new guidance will be issued to allow parents to collect their student children and take them back to the family home. I've had many emails from worried parents and stranded students, worried that communal living and lack of job opportunity over the summer puts their students at risk, first of all from COVID infection, from a risk of increasing mental health issues, and having no funds or limited income. And I declare an interest, I have to say, my own son's studying at Napier University. I feel the anxiety keen with myself, but I think it's important to mention my interest too.
First Minister.
I think Julian Martin's anxiety is well understood, and I'm sure parents across the country will very much relate to it at this time. It's an important issue, and I want to give an assurance today that it is one the Scottish Government is considering carefully, given, of course, the proximity to the end of the academic year and associated leases ending, the position of students collecting belongings and travelling home from accommodation. So we're considering all of that in the context of the framework for decision making, and we will issue revised guidance as appropriate as soon as possible. In trying to deal with this, as we do to some extent generally, I just want people to be aware we understand the multitude of different circumstances and different very detailed issues that are at stake here. And as we go further through this crisis, we will try to respond to and take account of as many of these as we can, but staying consistent, as we must do, with that imperative of keeping this virus under control.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I'm going to conclude First Minister's questions. Apologies to those members, both virtually and in the chamber, we couldn't accommodate. Parliament will resume at 2:30 with a statement on Brexit. Parliament is now suspended.